the spellings and pronunciations and meaning of the word in the context of morphology, that we can make better sense of all of that. And I don't know any other part of the language system that does that. Syllables don't go there because syllables don't represent meaning. So that's this idea. I'll move on instead of talking about that one. So let's get back to the research kind of story. So the historical context that I wanted to raise is that we know about this reading wars. There's been always this fight between phonics and whole language. And one thing I would argue is structured word inquiry isn't a response to phonics. It's not a response to the idea that instruction should reflect how the writing system works. So it's not based on either of these. The thing is, I just don't accept these as the two goalposts and that there's nothing else. Now, the common argument is that the research shows that phonics is more effective than whole language. As you know, my brother Jeff has addressed some of this research, and I'll pass on the links to this to the listeners, that I think he's got a really good argument that we have been really the research is making claims beyond what the evidence shows. But for now, let's not even deal with that. Let's just accept this argument for the second. If that were the case, what does the evidence, what does that tell us about the effect of morphological instruction? And the answer is it tells us nothing, because you haven't included in morphology in what you've been comparing, right? Evidence that A is greater than B doesn't tell me anything about C. It doesn't tell me C is good. It doesn't tell me C is bad. It tells me nothing about C. So the evidence comparing whole language and phonics doesn't actually speak to morphology. However, there's been a kind of an assumption in the research for decades. I often use this quote from Marilyn Adams' book, 1990 book, Beginning to Read, which is a major seminal piece. And in it, this isn't her main point of her book, but she makes this point: although teaching older readers about the roots, by which she means base morphemes, and suffixes of morphological, teaching beginning or less skilled readers about them may be a mistake. Well, that's a hypothesis. She didn't claim to have evidence, but she just put that out as a hypothesis. The problem is, a decade later, the National Reading Panel comes out. It doesn't mention morphological instruction at all. It is behaving as if this is an empirically based discovery, but it hasn't been tested. So they don't mention anything about morphological instruction. They do say something very valuable. They point out that they can't make any recommendations about vocabulary instruction because there haven't been enough vocabulary interventions upon which to make a research-based recommendation. And that knocked me out when I read that in 2003. And I said, what have you been doing? You haven't got enough interventions in vocabulary? That seems crazy. Well, guess what happened? After making that statement in this major thing, the interest in vocabulary instruction shoots up in the research. If you're a grad student and the National Reading Panel just said there's not enough vocabulary instructions and you're in literacy, that's a pretty good thing. That's a good place to put your research project because it's going to be needed, right? And I will say, I bet you that one of the reasons that morphology interest grew after this is because the link between vocabulary and morphology was the most obvious context. So in the motivation to do more vocabulary instruction, morphology started to get more traction. But they made no comment about morphology in that. And then I pointed to this other article. So we've gone a decade, and the air that researchers are breathing and just assuming is that, well, morphology, that might be interesting, but that's for the later years, without testing it. So now here we have, by 2008, almost a decade after the National Reading Panel, we have our very first review, just 7 studies. But then by 2010, our meta-analyses, and there's others, and another review. And what we find in all the meta-analyses, that everybody who looked at overall groups, everybody benefited. Now, this study by Goodwin and 2010 was on less able kids, so they can't say anything about overall kids.
Reading this paper today, actually.
Sorry?
I was reading this paper today.
Oh, there you go. And here we compared the effects of preschool to grade 2 kids to grade 3 to grade 8. And what we found is actually, in every case, the effects were at least equal to the other studies. and usually greater. So actually, and other people noticed that too, that the youngest got benefits from the morphological instruction. And when we looked at the less able, it was even clearer. In every case in our study, the less able gained more than those identified for difficulties gained more from the morphological instruction compared to the others. This surprised people, and it should surprise people, because the driving hypothesis was that you should avoid those groups. That the less able and the younger, you should do the phonology first. You shouldn't do the morphology yet. And yet the evidence is pointing in the opposite direction. So I would think that this should be an exciting discovery, because guess what? Whoa, we thought this was going to hurt, but it might help. Let's take a look at this. We should see how this goes. But somehow it hasn't really penetrated in the way it should. If we just follow the evidence of the meta-analyses, the evidence is we should be teaching morphology from the beginning of this instruction, and especially for less able kids. What we do not know is we don't have evidence of what kind of morphology instruction is better than another. You'd have to have studies that compared approaches, which we don't have. So I can't say that structured word inquiry is a better way to teach morphology in another way scientifically, but it's on the table that I'm asking researchers to take a look at. And guess what? We're not just teaching morphology, we're actually using it to teach phonology. Now, there is another study that came after that, 2013, that was really, they didn't call it a SWI intervention, but it did exactly what structured word inquiry does. The funny thing is, I got to tell you, Nate, when I read the first abstract of her first paper, in her abstract, she had written English spelling is an interrelationship of morphology, etymology, and phonology. And when you do the meta-analysis, you got to read every morphological intervention there is. And then it was like, oh my God, nobody is saying this. I bet you she studied with real spelling. I emailed her. Yep. As a teacher, she worked with real spelling. And so that tells you something, right? If I can tell from the abstract of that statement that somebody worked with real spelling, that tells you something. And in the paper, she did say that she used word sums, but she didn't mention the matrix. But when I emailed her, yes, they used the matrix. 120 kids in public schools in the UK, and they found that the SWI type intervention significantly improved literacy skills in word reading and spelling in standardized measures compared to the phonics condition. Now, I'm going to hasten to mention this paper often gets criticized because of the argument is that their phonics condition wasn't a true phonics condition. And this is an argument that I want to share whenever I do this. This is the text describing the intervention instruction. I won't ask you to read it now, but it's something that if you're watching the video, you can freeze. What I want to point out here is it's at the bottom of this paragraph that describes the other thing they did. Everything up here is absolutely typical phonics instruction, but they did also have a practice where the kids took a book home and read it in a more word recognition way. They did a word reading kind of thing, a whole word thing at home. So the criticism of this paper is this isn't really a phonics intervention because they used a whole word scheme. Well, I would caution people to realize the whole word scheme was something kids, 5 to 7 year olds, did on their own at home. So the idea of rejecting this paper when all of the in-class intervention study was phonics, I find that you can raise questions about it, but to dismiss this paper, I think, is unjustified.
I think that's a fair criticism.
It's common, and and because people say that about that paper, other people just don't even read the paper, right? So it's an issue. So this is part of your earlier question. What are some common criticisms and challenges about both structured word inquiry and morphological instruction? It could be useful as long as it doesn't take away time from phonics instruction. It's too complicated for young kids. They have to get the start on the letter sound correspondences. There's so much evidence we need that first. But remember, you can't draw that conclusion if you haven't compared to teaching including morphology first. Struggling kids need the phonology first. These are all empirical claims, and they're all the same claims that Adams made in 1990. But here we have evidence since 2010 that actually counters those hypotheses. And so we still now, here's a quote from Russell and Taylor 2018, where they argue, we believe that a focus on these morphological regularities is likely to be more appropriate in later years of primary schooling. Well, you can believe that, but you shouldn't make that statement without referencing the fact that this is in contrast to what the meta-analyses are saying. You can say we disagree with the meta-analyses for these reasons. I'm not saying you shouldn't raise this hypothesis, but you shouldn't do it without referencing the fact that it's actually countering the best evidence we have now. And another one, Castles, Russell, and Nation 2018, we would predict that the benefits of explicit morphological instruction are more likely to be observed somewhat later. Again, you can make that prediction, but it's a bit odd to do so without referencing the fact that, in fact, although we don't have enough research of morphology with young kids, this is not, concrete findings, but to ignore that all of the findings are in the opposite direction is a problem. And I would argue support for the hypothesis of phonology before you introduce any morphology would need evidence, if you're going to say it's a research-based claim, that including morphology from the start results in lower gains compared to isolated phonics. And I've yet to see anybody find that. I've never found a paper that taught morphology where anybody was harmed by the inclusion of morphology. But there's other facts that are very useful to see here. So Goodwin and Ann, in their two meta-analyses, they did better stats than we did in ours because they had effect sizes in the way that we didn't. And what they did is they looked at the phonological outcome. They looked at the outcomes in multiple aspects of reading. And guess what they found?
I was really surprised by these results.
The outcomes with the greatest effect were from including morphology were phonological. So phonological awareness had 0.48, 0.49 in their studies, and phonological recoding for the less able had 0.54. Decoding for the general was 0.59. The only outcome that had a lower effect size than the morphological outcomes was decoding for the less able. But even that was positive. So the argument that we have this danger, if we do morphology, we're going to hurt phonology, is not being supported by this. What we're finding is that when we teach morphology, it actually brings benefits to the phonology. And people are surprised by this, but actually it makes perfect sense when you understand this is an interrelationship. And I also want to highlight, in the meta-analyses that we did, we looked at 22 studies in our meta-analyses. And I think there was 5 studies out of 22 that even mentioned, even a little bit, the relationship between morphology and phonology. So they didn't teach that explicitly, and yet we still get those gains in phonology, right? And so imagine what these results would look like for phonology if we taught explicitly. And so the way that Goodwin and Ann responded to that, just because I wouldn't do this if you didn't have an audio only group, but I'll read the quote. So Goodwin and Ann write, similar to Bowers et al. 2010, results suggest that early morphological instruction may be particularly helpful, perhaps because of the synergistic relationship between phonology and morphology, and the larger repertoire of root, base, and affix meanings available for use. If a reciprocal relation exists between morphological knowledge and literacy, it makes sense to jumpstart that knowledge from an early age. So we're seeing that there's reasons to believe that teaching morphology should help phonology. And here's another key point. Though dyslexic kids, a typical characteristic that we talk about is phonemic awareness deficit. Well, guess what? If we take kids at school, we measure them on phonemic awareness tasks, and some kids are not as good at saying cat without the k, or identifying manipulating phonemes and such. And then we teach them for 3 years, and then we measure them on the reading later. It shouldn't surprise us when basically all the leverage for their learning was put on the one thing they have a deficit in. What if we teach morphology? Dyslexics don't have a deficit in morphological awareness. They don't have a deficit in meaning structure and seeing patterns and inquiring. So we can give them leverage for something they're strong at to help them with the thing that they're weak at. And in fact, I would say that we already see, without even doing that, that we're getting phonological games. And it makes sense to me that one thing those with phonological weaknesses have is dealing with grapheme phonic correspondences without that comparison. Now, there's another recent study from 2020, which is the next I'm not cherry picking meta-analyses. These are the only meta-analyses that I know of. And the next one after 2013 was 2020, and they were looking at the effects of morphology in spelling instruction for kids that were struggling. And what they found here, we did not find that phonics instruction is more effective than morphological interventions in the early years of formal literacy instruction or for more severe spelling deficits. According to our meta-regression analysis, it seems likely that phonics, morphological, and orthographic interventions are applicable across a wide age span. Notice that I always get a kick out of this. They point out that their qualitative synthesis makes them think that it should be done later. I never see meta-analyses point to the qualitative things that differ from the data. But this qualitative view fits with what they were thinking. So they mention it, but good on them. They say, however, the meta-analyses that we just looked through show that that's not true. So good on them. They went with the data, right? But I just find that fascinating. We just have this way of looking at the world. Even more significant is this one. So I have to add to what's here just because of the context. But what they say is, against our hypotheses, the efficacy of phonics interventions decreased with increasing severity of the kids' spelling deficits, right? So I'm just giving you that context. So the more deficits the kids had in spelling, the less effective the phonics interventions were. Whereas the efficacy of orthographic and morphological interventions increased with the increasing severity. Now, I'm willing to bet that very few researchers or teachers who follow the researchers or educators that follow the researchers would expect this finding.
See, I actually, this is a less surprising outcome to me, in the sense that when I was looking at the Goodwin 2010 meta-analysis earlier today, and I was really surprised that the phonological outcomes were higher than the spelling ones, because when I was listening to your talk on it, what you're saying, a lot of this type of instruction makes a lot of sense for spelling specifically to me, and for vocabulary as well. Yeah. But it makes, I don't personally see it as easily applicable to reading or decoding. You highlighted how the decoding outcome was the one that phonics outperformed in, but
I take your point there, Nate. It is a little bit more, it's less surprising perhaps to see that with the spelling, but that's, good on you for seeing that. But I'm saying people who are living in the reading research world, and the spelling research world, the literacy research world, this is not the expected finding, and the authors themselves were surprised by it. Now, I hasten to add, there was a note there that I didn't yet get to, which is, this is based on a small number of morphological studies, so this isn't conclusive. Well, guess one reason why there's not that many morphological interventions with young kids, because we've been telling people not to do it for decades. Mm-hmm. Right? So our point with the structured word inquiry is not that we have evidence that it's super strong. We keep saying we don't have enough evidence. What we have is evidence that there's reason to test it. And it goes along with what we know about morphological instruction. We have no reason from the data to fear it's going to hurt the phonology. In fact, we have reason to believe it could help. And it helps the less able and the younger more so far. Let's get more evidence for that, but that seems to be the way. So it's just, but this is not the air that people have been breathing for decades, is that you got to do the phonology first, and morphology is kind of this extra thing that you might do. Now that's growing more. There's a lot more interest in morphology than used to be. But And the other thing I want to highlight is we keep talking about this, and the issue keeps being about the early instruction. And that is, I think, is particularly important, and for the less able. But if people are concerned that they don't buy that yet, they still think you have to do the phonology first, go for it. But what I'm confused by is how come people who have that issue with the early instruction aren't paying attention to, why aren't you looking at this for grade 3 and up? Why? The matrix that I use all the time, I explain in the paper you're talking about, the first time the matrix appears in a research context is in, I think it's 2003 with Marcia Henry, who cites the real spelling use of the matrix. The next paper that uses the matrix is my 2010 paper. I've pointed to the matrix in the word sum in every paper I've ever done that mentions structured word inquiry. I've yet to, there's now in 2020 is the first paper I've seen that doesn't have me in it that shows a matrix. It's like, I don't understand why this isn't being picked up on. And if you fear that it's not appropriate for the younger grades, okay, why don't we look at it with the older grades? And I point in that latest article to research by Rassel and stuff showing great ideas that I totally agree with teaching older kids, but why not reference this work? So there's something, so I just want to highlight, yes, I think it's super important for the younger kids and the less able. Don't have strong research evidence for it yet. Have very suggestive research, because so far what we know about teaching morphology says helps the younger and less able the most. And I think there's actually just a logical reason for it in terms of understanding how something works. And when we get into, as Jeff always points out, in psychology, we know learning is better when it's meaningful and when it's organized in a meaningful way. And that's what we're doing when we work with the matrix and the word sum. So there's all sorts of theoretical and logical reasons to expect this to work, but we need to test it. Yes. Right. But we have no evidence that we have nothing that's showing us reasons why we should expect there to be harm from this. So, and the only other thing that I wanted to show in terms of the research, I won't read it because it's too long, but those of you who are watching, if you want to freeze this page, there's a long section from a morphology, a review of the effect of morphology on reading aloud. And they just speak so directly to the concepts that we've been talking about that I just wanted to put that there. We won't bother reading it now. If you're watching the video, you can freeze it and have a read of it. But it's just highlighting exactly the concepts that we've been pointing to. And the last little slide is to highlight everything we've been talking about is into the writing system itself is interrelated. We haven't talked about these 4 questions of structured word inquiry, but these are the questions we use to guide teachers. And you don't use them like a recipe every single time, but it helps us make sure we think about the meaning of words, how they're built, their relatives, and how the grapheme phoneme correspondences operate in that system, which is why we can explain the spelling of action. This also talks about the interrelationship. The reading system is interrelated. And then we talk about morphology as a binding agent in our paper with my paper with John Kirby. And that this builds on Perfetti's lexical quality hypothesis that I won't go into now, but if you're interested in that, you can read about that. And also, I would argue to cognitive load theory that you had some questions about. I can pass people a link to some writing about that. People think, they often challenge structured word inquiry because they think that it's got too much cognitive load. But I think that's a misunderstanding of cognitive load theory, because what we understand, one thing we understand is, yes, we don't want to overload the working memory, absolutely, but cognitive load theory also says you have to make learning meaningful, and that you need practice, and you need to understand these connections. And I do all sorts of things around cognitive that drive what I'm doing, so that it takes work. In fact, it takes extra cognitive load to shift your long-term memories. So by having this kind of, the rote memory practice isn't very effective at that. But understanding the meaning, spelling connections, and the pronunciations, that is actually what cognitive load says we should do. The multi-memory routes, the writing out loud, the spelling out loud, these are all ways of building well-integrated mental representation of schema of orthography in your head that you build up through practice, such that when you're reading, you can recognize those structures. And that's where the tie that comes to the reading is that by building up your recognition of the actual structures, when you're reading, you have more efficient access to it. And that's, again, Perfetti, lexical quality, but I would tie it to cognitive load and what we're talking about with why this morphology has such a key role in understanding graphemes and phonemes and meanings of words and all that.
Well, that was a really fascinating and interesting interview.
Hopefully, but we'll see.
You know what? Actually, I forgot that my longest interview ever is technically with your brother, although that was debate.
I'll be proud.
I think you might have beat him. I'm not sure. It's around the same time now.
But Nate, I got to say something about that. I really appreciate that you're willing to do that, because this is what I mentioned before we were recording, I think, that one of the challenges, yes, trying to explain something that is not in the way you've looked at the world is harder than just refining a version of something you've always done.
Yeah.
So when people try to ask me questions, and I can't answer on Twitter how I teach young kids. I mean, it's not possible. I point to videos and such, and I'll point you guys to videos that you can watch this stuff and examples. I'll make sure Nate gets links for that. But you have to explain the orthography so that you can even talk about the research. Right, so it's such a. I mean, when we first got the meta-analysis out, I remember presenting a poster at a conference before the actual paper was out, and people would come up to my poster and they were shocked, like, you found that it was that morphology got its greatest benefit with the younger. They couldn't imagine it. So, well, how do you teach morphology to grade 1 kids? And I remember sitting at the poster talking to fancy researchers. So, well, I can say, well, I sit with kids in the class. We come back from recess. Hey kids, do you like to play at recess? Oh yes. So what were you playing at recess? And hey, wait a second. Notice I added in. You can't say what were you play at recess. That would sound funny. They know that that's not how they talk. Play. What did I affix at the end of play to make playing? Oh, ing. Okay. Oh, what can I fix ing? Oh, playing, jumping, running. Oh, so you can fix ings at the end of words to affect the way you use that word. Okay. And then people will say, oh, that makes sense, and walk away. It's like, but if they haven't seen it, they just don't have any frame of reference, and a lot of people, I think, turn it off without looking. And I point to some videos that you can see kindergartners doing this stuff and all that.
I will say, I think Twitter is a terrible medium. I really hate Twitter. I went on it very briefly after my interaction with your brother, and I was just like, well, I hate this.
Yeah.
In part because I don't feel you can give any meaningful response on Twitter to anything.
It's so brutal, yeah.
I know. Someone asked me a series of questions, and I'm just like, I can't respond to these questions in 140 characters.
And I'm terrible at figuring out how you write multiple tweets in a row. I'm
terrible. But I will say also, as much as I debated a little with your brother, I actually feel a little bit of a kinship towards both of you in that you're very contrarian. And the name of this podcast is Pedagogy Non Grata, because we felt like a lot of what was being taught as gospel within the education community as evidence-based wasn't actually evidence-based if you went and looked at the meta-analysis research. And that was my specific focus. Just, hey, we're being told this is the best strategy. I go look at all the meta-analysis research, and it looks terrible in the research, but there's still 1,000 scholars out there saying every day, this is the best. Yeah. I find that very confusing.
And it's hard to get. Research is complicated. There's lots of things that can go wrong, and we should be looking at it critically, and we should be letting it affect our thinking. But we also should be bringing in logic and trying other things, and seeing and then testing ideas. But I do find that there is such a focus on one way of thinking that makes it very hard to see something else. And again, I go back to cognitive load. Once you look at the world in a certain way, it's very hard to look at it in a new way. And people often take what I'm saying as a challenge to what they've been doing for so long. And that's not my point, but yeah, okay. If let's have a conversation about what we're saying. But what I keep on getting is, but the research says something else. And then when I say, please show me a paper where including morphology has caused any harm to anybody, that this claim that we should avoid it doesn't seem to need to have an empirical basis. Somehow you don't need evidence to say don't do something. You only need evidence to say do something. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure I agree with that. And by the way, I see the value of what happens in classrooms and with teachers doing this. That's anecdotal, so we need evidence. But what I'm finding is that the arguments against me are as if I'm violating what the science shows, and I actually think I'm doing a good job of representing the science. People can argue with me about that, and I'm happy to have that argument. But I keep trying to get to the actual evidence, and that's Jeff's experience with his paper about the evidence from phonics. I don't see people actually explaining what about his arguments are wrong.
I think this is a problem with whatever reason with our field, in that people fall really heavily into camps. And I've made the mistake, I think, at times of calling myself within a camp, but I think overall, I'd like to see myself as outside of a camp, in the sense that I just want to look for principles that make sense. I want to find the things that the factors and the principles that make sense, rather than being like, oh, I'm a disciple of this scholar. Everything they say I find true. I have no interest in that.
Well, good on you.
Whatsoever.
Yeah. And obviously, I'm biased. I think the way that I teach is the best way. I remember when I was working with John Kirby, I was very lucky. He was a brilliant supervisor for me to have. We did not look at a lot of things in the same way, but he was impressed the hell out of me because he would engage in the argument with me, and he doesn't look at everything the same way, but he was willing to have his mind changed by evidence and argument, and I was willing to have my ideas changed by things he showed me. But so he was surprised at the outcome of our meta-analyses when it made sense to me. But that was so valuable to have somebody who had a way of looking at the world. But he would also describe himself as not in a camp. Now I'm in a camp in a way, but I'm happy to be disproven if I can find somebody who gives me an argument to change my mind. And so, whether it's a camp or not, but I 100% agree with you that the evidence of an argument, the one thing it does not matter is who said it. It's the argument that we need to look at. And so, anyways, that's the kind of way I
would agree with that. I just want to make one final note on that, is that I've said this many times. If you are not willing to change your mind based off evidence, you cannot call yourself evidence-based.
Or science.
Yeah. It's pretty simple, but I think there's a lot of things people would tell you, even within our field. Oh, I hold this sacred. I know this is science. This is evidence-based, and no research you could ever show me would ever change my mind. Well,
yeah. Well, that's why I do launch on these things with words like does and sign and such, because I have yet to see, I see lots of research papers say that English spelling makes much more sense than people usually think. Of course, there are some irregularities, and if they mention an irregularity, they usually include does. And my point is, if, and pick any of your favorite irregular words, if I can now explain does, and previously the way you were taught told you that it's irregular, that is evidence that the way you were taught has a flaw in it, right? It's not just about the word does. It's like, wait a second. If I thought does was irregular, and I now understand it, what a scientist needs to do is say, well, whoa, that's interesting. What does that imply about the other things I've been doing? So that's why I focus on these things, and sign and signal and all this stuff. Oh, and what we find by looking at does and sign and signal, all that, is this foundational principle of the writing system, morphemic consistency, which I've never heard that phrase in all my 9 years of teaching. I never knew that there was anything to think about. I remember having a teaching book before I ran into real spelling, and it said something about one of the strategies you can use to help your kids with their spelling is to link it to meaning. And I literally went to a friend of mine who was related to the publication, and what do you mean that you can use meaning? Like, I had no idea that meaning could have anything to do with spelling. It seemed like an absurd statement. And now it's like central to me. So it's like, whoa, look. But when it makes sense, check it out. But also be willing to say, if what I used to think tells me that's irregular and I now understand it, it's not that I can now change how I teach the word does that's important. What's important is that I realize there must be something wrong with the way I was looking at this before. And now you take your time and check it out.
Huh. That's all really interesting. Actually, to be fair, I thought the does word was the one that interested me the most of all the words we examined, weirdly. But I want to give the audience a chance to find you. So where can the audience find more about you or your website?
So my website is wordworkskingston.com. It's a silly name because WordWorks was taken when I did it, so I put Kingston, and now it's ironic that I actually do not that much work in Kingston and work all over the world instead. But it's about this idea of, and the book that I made is built on the lessons from my intervention, and it's called Teaching How the Written Word Works, which is what I like to do. But if you Google that, I'm sure you'll find the website. There's a YouTube page with lots of videos. If you WordWorks, you'll find it. But I'll send you, Nate, a document with some links to things people can explore, including other people that do this work, and that way they can explore more on their own.
Well, I hope people do explore your work, and I actually really genuinely hope that you get to do some more research in this realm, and I'd like to see some more highly powered meta-analysis on this topic. But
All right.
It's been great having you on. I really enjoyed the interview, and thanks for the
Well, thanks for being so patient with the time.